A lot of people treat this as if there are really clearly two options: possible or impossible. I think any interesting thinker, again, in the East or the West, knows that there are different kinds and degrees of like necessity or freedom or possibility and impossibility. In other words, when you say something is possible or impossible, you're saying it relative to not only your position but also the object about which you're speaking. Let me give you an example. So my father, I like to give this one. If my father walks, or if somebody walks into the room and says, hey, your dad just out there on the street killed somebody, an innocent person, a random person, for $10, and then he went and bought cigarettes, I'm going to immediately say, no, he didn't. That's impossible. What does it mean whenever I say that's impossible in that situation, relative to that situation? Does that mean I'm saying my dad is physically incapable? Like, can he not, does he not have hands? Maybe. I mean, has he been, what am I saying he can't actually, like, he doesn't know how to use a gun? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying he's not physically capable when I say impossible. I'm saying that I know my father and I know his character. And I know him so securely and certainly that I know he would never do that. So interestingly there, you could say both that my dad murdering an innocent person for $10 to go buy cigarettes, and he never smoked in his life, is both possible and impossible at the same time. It's possible in the sense that there's nothing externally restraining him or making him physically incapable of carrying out that act. But it is also simultaneously what I want to maybe call morally impossible for my dad to do that, given his actual character and who he is, who I know him to be. Now, there are other options, right? You could say, well, I'm sorry, like, here's the video, and I'm going to prove to you exactly, like, he did do it, and I'll look at the video, and maybe I see him. And then I'm like, but then what do? I immediately start saying, well, then he must be like on something, or he's out of his mind somehow. But that's another way of saying that I know it's impossible for him to do that, even if he's done that out of his mind, because in a certain way, he's not really himself when he did it. So this is a kind of moral judgment, a subtle sort of moral, might even say intersubjective, like personal knowledge, that is not knowledge. It's really true. But it isn't something you could abstract like you could a mathematical theorem or formula. And this is the kind of nuance that I would say gets lost in a lot of these discussions about God. So my answer then is, I think it was impossible for God not to create. Not in the sense that something is externally making it like forcing him to do so, or something internal. And some people don't like this either. Like, well, so what? Internally, like he has to do it of his own sort of nature. And it's like, well, you're already conceiving something internal to him being still alien to him, and then forcing him to do it. Like my hunger forces me to look for food. That's not what I mean either. So in that sense, it's possible to conceive of a God who wouldn't create, but only to the degree that you're really abstracting and not thinking about who God actually is. Morally, personally, who he's revealed himself to be in Christ, who he's revealed himself to be in the Son who in his kenosis empties himself, not only becomes a baby and lives a human life, but also suffers and dies, goes to hell, and resurrects on the third day in order to bring up Adam and Eve from the pits. So that's the guy we're talking about. Guy, right? That's the God we're talking about. And if you're asking, could that God not have created? I would say on that level, no, of course he could not have not created. It's so integral to who he is, in his goodness and his love, right? So what does that mean? Am I saying that God's dependent on the world now? Have I made God? Well, no, I don't think so either. I mean, I think we don't really do justice very often to what Paul calls in Romans 13 the debts of love. Owe no man any debt except the debt of love. So there's two kinds of debt, two kinds of obligation. there is the kind of obligation that, like, I need my parents to take care of me as a baby because otherwise I can't live, or I need food and nutrients in order to sustain my body or else it will die. That's a very almost kind of automatic, and that's often what the ancients meant by necessity. It's like an automatic, intentionless, like instinctual necessity. But there's another kind of necessity and obligation, and it's actually a necessity that's at once free, but all the more obliged. And this is the stuff that we experience again in morality, but also in love. You know, if you give me a gift, do I have to give you a gift back? Well, it's again abstractly possible that I don't. There's nothing externally making me give you a gift. But if I want to be a good friend, if I want to be a good human being ultimately and show reciprocity, there's no other way to do it. I do need to get, in that sense, I feel obliged to give you a gift, but I don't feel like my freedom is canceled out when I do that. I feel like it's a blossoming, a perfection of like the highest parts of ourselves and sensibility. A last example I like to give is, we know that freedom and necessity, or possibility and impossibility, I mean something, right, these are all relative judgments. These often coalesce in ways that it's hard for us to conceptualize. So if I see a beautiful sunset, or hear a beautiful piece of music, or read an incredible poem or piece of literature, I even usually slip into the passive voice. I am moved by this. Or I see my daughters born, that moment. I'm moved to love them. I didn't sit there and say, let me weigh my options. I want to see, I could love them, maybe not. I could be moved by this sunset, maybe not. And it's not like I have a neutral space where I'm just choosing among options, and that's what it means to be free. No, rather in those very moments, I'm compelled to acknowledge the beauty of the sunset, to acknowledge the profundity of my daughter being born, the love that wells up within me, far apart from a choice, but more like a perfection, a fulfillment. And in those moments, am I less free? No, in some ways I think I'm more free, precisely because I am moved. So it looks like necessity and freedom are becoming together what neither of them are conceptually apart from each other. Something more than both in one. That's what I think is, and it's so fascinating to me that someone like Dionysius, the Areopagite, some people call him Pseudo-Dionysius, that's exactly how he describes in one passage God's act of creation. He is moved out of his mind for us, bedazzled by our beauty, moved to create what he loves. Or St. Maximus the Confessor, one of my favorites, that out of his great love for us, he becomes the very thing he loves. So that's why he becomes human, and that's why he makes the world, right? So those look more to me, if we're looking for an analogy, they look more like aesthetic moments, which are not, therefore, illogical or irrational. They're like the perfection of rationality, of being a properly human spirit. These are the moments where we're most welling over with meaning and brimful of significance. And yet they're not choices that we just make in an arid space. Nor are they something that overwhelms us in the sense of like coercion or violation. They are more than either of those. And so I think in the debates, did God have to create the world or not? The temptation is to immediately go to, well, what does it mean to have to do something? Necessity. Well, what does it mean to freely do something as opposed to necessarily doing it? That's freedom, which is just like what? Choice or something. Like pure choice among options. Create or not to create. That is the question. And I think those are just already the wrong framework. So do I think God could have not created? No. Do I think that means God's dependent on the world? In the way that I'm dependent on food or something? No. Do I think that God is in the depths of his own love, and the God who is love has obligated himself to the debts of love with his creation, which is naturally inferior to him and yet destined to become equal to him in theosis? Yes. There's an interesting case in St. Anselm. Maybe not someone you would necessarily think to go to for anything like a universalist sort of view or a kind of necessity of creation. But he makes the analogy in one passage where he says, when God created the world, he took on like a monastic vow, the obligations to bring it to perfection. And there's debates about, obviously St. Anselm himself wasn't an explicit universalist, like every single individual is going to be saved. But a lot of people have made the argument his thought ought to lead there. But I think the important point is on the question of necessity and freedom, even he felt moved to make an analogy kind of close to his own life because he was a monastic, to say it's like God taking on a vow, which he freely takes on, and there he's not addressing whether or not that's just freedom of choice or what. It's just no one else externally obligated him. It's not necessity in that external sense, but he takes it on of his own volition. But in taking on the act of creation, he takes on all the obligations or entailments therein. Like a monastic does. You take the vows and you've chastity, poverty, obedience, right? So in that first, now you might have moments, and this isn't not like God, but you as a human being might have moments where you don't want to fulfill them. And so you feel an obligation. But the obligation comes from within you because you've already obliged yourself to it, right? So Anselm isn't going as far as perhaps I would like to go and say, I don't even think the hypothetical that God could have not created the world makes sense. It's not that it doesn't make, but he is saying, right, that it's, that given God's act of creation, even there or from that point, we can say God does take on obligations which he is then, in a sense, obliged to fulfill. Call it the debts of love. Call it the voluntary act of taking on obligations, whatever you want to call it. That doesn't go quite as far as perhaps I would want to go or other thinkers would go, but it's another way to conceptualize it. So for me, then, if I do want to go that one step back removed, I would say there is not a world, or there is not a case, a hypothetical case that's a real case, where God would not have created the world. It's not because abstractly to think of God disallows that immediately. It's precisely because God isn't abstract. He's love. So that's how I would say I get the urges. I understand why. So I understand what people are trying to protect when they want to say, well, God could have not created anything. What they're trying to deny, and this is, I think, true even on the Roman Catholic side, even through Vatican I, what they're trying to deny is that God needed the world in the way in which you need food, or God needs the world in the way I need air to breathe. He doesn't need it in some mechanistic, like visceral sense, or almost like organic sense, like he grows bigger over duration when he adds the world to himself. So I get that, and I agree with that, but I don't think that contradicts a deeper view, again, a more synthetic view, a deeper synthesis that says, sure, that's not true, but is there a deeper sense where freedom and necessity really are one, where what's seemingly abstractly possible, in this case, God not creating, is also at the same time impossible. In a way that's similar to my dad. Yes, it's abstractly possible, abstract from who he is. There is nothing externally in my considerations of him as a human being that would say he couldn't commit a terrible act. But knowing who he is, turning to the determinate one, and in theology it would mean turning to the God who's actually revealed in Revelation in Christ. Given that, can I conceive of him being basically fundamentally indifferent to the act of creation itself, to give the gift of life to all of his children? No, I can't. I can't conceive that at all. So I think that's the way I would want to thread the needle. I don't want to simply say God had to create the world and then say nothing else, because then it sounds like I'm falling into the pit that people are afraid of. But I also don't want to simply say, God could have not created the world and leave it there either. It's abstractly, God does not need the world to be God, but that says hardly anything at all of interest. What we need to do is go on and say, but what does it mean that God is love? What does it mean when the saints say stuff like God couldn't do without us and he was moved out of himself in ecstasy of love to create us? I mean, that's got to mean something. It can't just mean something's being affirmed there. It can't just mean, oh, God happened to care about you. Lucky for you. It's God couldn't have not cared for you. And so it's really like the determinateness, that is to say the concreteness of God's love, which kind of always already obliterates our abstractions and conceptions of that love. And we're usually playing catch up. We're usually trying to figure out how my concepts and their oppositions, like freedom, necessity, possible, impossible, how do they conform to this reality which is already surpassed those. But I do want to land on the side of eventually coming to a qualified sense to say, no, I don't think God could have not loved, nor do I think that violates, the infinity or transcendence of his nature. That's a thing that, I do notice a lot. We're pretty comfortable with saying God's nature is like super nature, or God's essence is super essential. That is to say, above our conceptions of nature. But we usually want to leave it at that negative point. God is just not like any nature you know. I think the next step you have to take is to say, precisely because God's nature is not like any other nature that we know, is not just one among other objects, right, in the world or beings in the world, that redounds back into an affirmation of his love as the fundamental reality of both God and the world and their relation. So, yes, he's not like any other nature, and he's super essential. His essence is super essential. But the way we know that most adequately is precisely in his ecstasy, his going beyond, his act of creating, and for me, ultimately, his act of incarnating, which for me are ultimately interchangeable. So, he's not just not like our love. His love is excessive and inordinate compared to our meek, finite, limited love. So that's the affirmative point. You can't just end on the negative point, because then you basically just make God, I think, as fundamentally, like his fundamental disposition to creation is indifference. He could have, take it or leave it. He could have done without you or not. Lucky for you, he wanted you for some reason. I don't know. Why? Well, because he loved you. Okay, but is his love contingent? No, he's always loved you. He's eternal. If he loves you forever. Okay. So then how could he not have loved me into being, right? And so we're usually downloading some other sense of God's love being supra love as almost being not love. it's and that's always a tough thing, because something can look the same initially as either less than or more than love as we know it. And I think we usually go to the lower for some reason. Oh, since God can is sort of less obliged to love us than we are obliged to love each other. But why wouldn't it be, as George MacDonald says, it's exactly because we're not naturally his children that he's all the more obliged to love us. Why wouldn't it be superordinate in his love? Why wouldn't it be excessive? Why wouldn't it be plentiful, right, and overflowing even? Not in a mechanistic or senseless or mindless way, but precisely in a way that it could never be violated, it could never be changed. And that's where I would land. St. Maximus says that God never changes his purpose in regard to any being. Because if he did, that actually paradoxically would make God dependent on us. Because he would create and react in ways that he didn't intend to from the beginning. Like in response to you, like, oh, okay, you're not as lovable as I kind of had hoped you would be. So I'm going to adjust to that. And so now God's creating and acting in ways that are clearly dependent on us, whether our successes or failures. But I think rather we need to foreground, and here I have a kind of resonance with Augustine. It's just not the pessimism, but the formal point that it's God who is, God is the one who has fixed his purpose on us from before anything else, and there is no other reason. There's no other reason God created except that he loves us, and there's no other reason deeper than love for God loving. So that's the kind of affirmation that I mean when I say I do not simply accept as stated that God could have not created. Or if I accepted it, it would be trivial because it would be about a God that doesn't exist.